Roman glanced over as he and Patton walked into the flat, and thankfully, despite the state they had been in, the last time they'd seen the two, who now stepped inside, they all seemed to be in good spirits now. Virgil smiled as he saw the movie that had been chosen, Les Miserables, and he doubted it was a coincidence that they had picked the musical, seeing as it was the one they had watched the first time he had joined the others for a movie night. More importantly, it was the film that had actually spurred him to realize that there were things he had in common with Princey. A smile actually made its way to his lips as he sat down in front of the television with the other three. The best part, however, was that unlike before, both the creative and anxious traits were comfortable turning the songs into duets. They even made a game out of it to keep everyone laughing, seeing who would come up with the most absurd harmonies, whose voice would go the highest, or who could still manage to sing with a mouthful of popcorn. In the end, the point was to try and distract not only the other two, but themselves from the pain they had all been struggling with for 5 months, and the harsh realities of life for a while. As they continued acting ridiculous, Morality joined in, singing the lyrics that he knew, but proceeded to unintelligibly ramble the rest of the time. Before long, even Logan had fallen whim to the side-splitting laughter, and even the more depressing bits of the movie became difficult to take seriously. Whether it was due to the purposely bad singing, or the small, sarcastic comments they would make, by the finale of the musical, no one could have guessed that they were in grief. All good things had to come to an end, though, and if they wanted to partake in anything the next day, they all needed to get some rest, so each of them returned to their respective apartments. As anxiety stepped into his, cautiously making his way through the rest of the wreckage from the first night that he couldn't be bothered to clean up, he realized just how tired he was. The events of the day felt as if they happened a century ago, but had drained him of his energy all the same, so he was content just collapsing into his bed without even changing into pajamas. He had no idea how long he had been asleep when a knocking at his door drew him to consciousness. Groggily, he got to his feet, seeing as it was more than likely the youngest character was seeking a shoulder to lean on, so the eldest didn't even bother messing with his hair. He was thankful, however, that he had chosen to not change out of his clothes as he made his way across the room once more. When he opened the entrance to his flat, he didn't recognize who was standing before him, but his voice was clear and authoritative.
Sorry to bother you at such a late hour, but I need to verify. Are you Virgil?
He nodded, but didn't speak.
In that case, the Council of the Astral Plane has requested an audience with you and your colleagues immediately.
There was only one reason the council would want to see them, but anxiety hadn't expected it so soon. They were supposed to have 6 months before reassignment. Glaring at the man who stepped aside to let him out of his apartment, he saw his 3 companions waiting in the corridor. They all looked downtrodden, clearly coming to the same conclusion he had. They were about to be separated early. He couldn't help but notice that Patton was sobbing, and he began to move in his direction, but one of the escorts stopped him with an arm across his chest. The motion infuriated Virgil, and he turned to the perpetrator, and before he even knew what he was doing, his voice filled the silence.
With all due respect, this is this moral trait's first reassignment, and he's seeking the comfort of his friends, a right which you have just denied him. I've never seen an escort with the gall to do something so crass, and quite frankly, I find that kind of behavior for a council-elect to be appalling.
He held the gaze of the man, not daring to blink for fear that it would look as if he were backing down.
Therefore, if you're not willing to let him pass, then I request that you allow me to help someone who I consider to be family.
The escort didn't seem pleased with the idea of being reprimanded by a civilian, but one of his co-workers whispered something in his ear, and he turned back to face the fight-or-flight reflex.
You may help your companion and accompany him and the others to your audience.
Thank you.
He all but spat the words at the man as he walked over and drew Patton into an embrace. It wasn't until they were preparing to teleport to the council that he released him, and registered the shocked and impressed glances that the others gave him. It wasn't common for someone to talk back to, and especially demand anything from an escort, but he was a shadowed lifer, and knew his rights well. Moments later, they stood back in the room they had appeared in upon their arrival back to the astral plane, a deafening silence surrounding them. The smiles plastered on all the faces of the officials sickened him with anger. Did they find joy in tearing families apart? He knew that these aspects would never understand the pain of assignment, or how it felt to lose a host. They would never know the difficulties of being cut off from the rest of the astral plane, or how it felt to restart with a new set of traits every few years. But even with all of that, he never expected them to be so sociopathic. Virgil was ripped from his thoughts as the leader of the council addressed them.
Am I correct in thinking that you believe you are here to be reassigned?
Though he was still furious, the question left him mystified. In all of the times that he had returned to the astral plane, he had never been asked something so obvious. He made sure that the speaker met his glare before he responded, because Anxiety remembered the day he was elected to lead. He wanted this man to know just how horrific his sarcasm-fueled joke was.
Just in case this is some sort of miscalculation, we were supposed to have another month before our reassignment.
When his words elicited giggles, the negative side wanted nothing more than to lunge at the council members, and he probably would have, had they not been in a loft above him.
What can any of you possibly find humorous about this situation? Please inform me, because I don't see it. Between this and the appalling behavior of the escort when he denied my friend his right to seek comfort from us, I am disgusted by what this government has become.
Young man, it would be in your best interest to watch your tongue and apologize to the council.
The eldest turned slowly to face the escort who had spoken, rage flowing through his veins like the liquid fire from the river Phlegethon.
Young.
He paused, sweeping his gaze around the chamber before returning his attention to the one who had made the demand, his tone rising in volume until he was shouting.
You've got to be kidding me. I'm almost certain I'm older than anyone in this room. I've dealt with more than anyone else here, and I'm not going to sit idly by letting you take away our rights, watch you berate us, and have you get a laugh out of the pain my colleagues and I are going through.
Now it was the council leader who addressed him.
As an elder, I'm sure I surpass you in age, wisdom, and most certainly in rank. Therefore, I do expect an apology from you.
The darkly dressed side actually dared to scoff.
Oh, please. You may outrank me, but with the way you've been acting, you certainly aren't as wise as you're claimed to be. As for age, I remember when you were appointed.
The words he spoke were true, but he wasn't finished yet.
Look me up in your databanks. There's a term for traits like me, and that shadowed lifer.
He didn't miss the gasps that echoed through the auditorium, and the stunned expressions that most of the officials now wore.
This conversation may very well be the reason I never make it to Elysium, but at least I know I sealed my fate by defending my family.
He didn't mean to, but he screamed the last sentence to anyone who would listen, and in a room as large as the one they were in, the words rang through the air like church bells.
And that is something I will never apologize for.
In the silence that followed, a force slammed into him, gripping his arm, and the sound of sobs reached his ears. Without a second thought, he wrapped his free arm around Morality, drawing him close.
Virgil, don't throw away your chance at Elysium because of us!
He kept his voice a whisper, making sure no one else could hear him.
And let them treat you the way Deceit did? I don't think so.
Moments later, Patton pulled away and released his grip on him, glaring up at the leader. But what he did next left Anxiety speechless.
If Virgil will never be allowed to go to Elysium, then I never want to go there either!
Me neither!
Both Logan and Roman jumped forward, looking at each other in surprise for a moment, as their voices mirrored one another. Something about the reaction must have taken the council by surprise, as much as it did him, seeing as they no longer demanded an apology, and the council head spoke in a soft tone, as if he had forgotten all about the altercation.
He was telling the truth. You four would really give up anything for each other. Even a shadowed lifer.
The prince moved to his side, his shoulders back defensively.
Of course! We may have had a rocky history, and we may not always see eye to eye, but I know for certain that Virgil would do anything for us, and we would do the same for him without question.
I must agree, if he somehow managed to miss it, Virgil did just call us his family. He's proven to us repeatedly that he truly means that, and I think I speak for all of us when I say we see him in the same light.
He was taken aback by the emotion in the voice of the second eldest, as he moved to stand next to them. At the statement, some of those who sat above them had varying expressions of shock, and for some reason relief, but the woman who appeared to be second in command was the first to speak her mind.
I have never seen a group of facets grow so close to one another. I thought he was joking when he told us that.
Anxiety wondered who they were repeatedly referring to. but he didn't have long to think over it before his attention was demanded again.
He said you all had developed a familial bond, but I didn't think it would be anything like this.
She stepped back at a gesture from the leader, but it was Princey's voice which rose into the quiet.
I don't know where you learned all that, but it is true, and now you're going to rip our family apart.
I can't listen to this. Why didn't you tell them?
A familiar voice filled with horror and anger echoed from the corridor off to the right of the auditorium, and was followed by quick footfall. The fight-or-flight reflex couldn't help the hope that ignited in his heart like a candle as the four of them turned to face the doorway.
You would just let them grieve for 5 months without the slightest hint as to what was really happening?
The question came to its conclusion, and a sense of joy that anxiety hadn't felt in millennia coursed through him as the speaker stepped into view. He almost couldn't believe his eyes. Standing before them, returned to the peak of his health, and looking as he did not too long after starting YouTube, was Thomas Sanders. His hair had even taken on the bright shade of purple that had been the influence for his own eccentric wardrobe change. He was broken from his thoughts as Patton stepped away from his side.
Thomas, is it really you?
Despite the tears that rolled down his cheeks, the moral trait looked happier than he had in months. Their beloved host, the one who had left a mark so close to their hearts, now stood only a few feet away, smiling at them, his hazel eyes sparkling with the same tears. Suddenly, Thomas looked up to the loft, more specifically the council leader.
All this time you left them in the dark, when even me, who was stuck in the fields of Asphodel for months, was told. Did it really never cross your minds, any of you, to tell them what you managed to get to me, despite the fact I was literally in a different world?
The four sides remained silent, their confused stupor only made more intense by the words that had been said. Meanwhile, the council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, until the leader was forced to respond.
We thought it best not to inform them until we were sure that we had secured your soul from Asphodel. We didn't want to tell them, seeing as we feared your referrals would not go through before the time of their reassignment.
The way he repeated his first statement, with different wording, made it sound as if he were trying to convince himself as well as anyone else. The exasperation that shone in Thomas's eyes only grew stronger.
And you couldn't keep them here for a week or two longer because...
There was more rustling above them, but the traits glanced at one another, trying to process this newest development before speaking. All they were able to do was agree to wait for an explanation, but they all looked back to the YouTuber as he piped up once more.
That's what I thought. But there is nothing stopping you now, so what are you waiting for?
Under the watchful gazes of those on the ground floor, the leader shook his head.
We kept a close eye on the four of you and your host for the entirety of your assignment. When we spoke to you initially upon your return to the astral plane, we made an error. We thought your relations with one another were far weaker than we discovered them to be.
He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing.
When you arrived, however, there was a moment in which you helped one another in a way that only I hesitate to say it, but only the way a family would. Needless to say, we were a bit astonished by this concept, and after you were dismissed, a vote was taken. Relations between traits was the only testing category in which you all fell shy in your scores. But that moment, soon after your arrival, made us doubt our previous decision. The vote we took was to see if that action would qualify you to pass the one testing category that you had failed, and the outcome greatly exceeded that of the 2/3 requirement.
Their heads shot up, but anxiety forced himself to extinguish the flame of hope in his chest. The odds of such an honor being placed upon not only his family, but himself as a shadowed lifer was just too far-fetched. Morality, however, so young and innocent, asked the question that he wouldn't dare.
Does this mean...
The head of the council glanced down at them.
Despite the altercation from earlier, yes. You four, along with your hosts, have passed in all testing categories.
The fight-or-flight reflex held his breath, as he waited to wake from the dream he was in, or to have his heart shattered, but neither happened.
Congratulations. All 5 of you will be granted the greatest gift and the highest honor. You will all achieve and enter Elysium this day.
The next few moments were blurred with elation, joyous tears, hugs, and reunions with someone that they were sure they lost forever. Virgil could hardly believe what his senses were telling him. After so much pain, heartache, all 4 phases of a trait's life, and so many hosts that he had lost count, he was finally going to Elysium. By far, however, the most humbling and wonderful part was that he was going with the 4 people he cared about most. When the chaos subsided somewhat, the second-in-command moved to the front, clearing her throat to demand their attention, and for the first time her smile appeared to be genuine.
Thomas, could you step forward, please?
He was clearly confused, but after a few nods from the sides, he did just what was asked.
Thomas, just so you're aware, when traits return to the astral plane, they receive a symbolic mark to remember the host that they just lost. And the closer the mark is to the heart, the more the host meant to those who bear it. Furthermore, when a host goes to Elysium, they too are granted the mark.
She waved her hand over the online personality.
And now you have yours.
Thomas stiffened slightly, clearly battling between the positive emotions he felt and the information he had just been given.
What is this mark?
He trailed off, as if he were afraid to ask the rest of his question.
And how close to the heart is it?
Her eyes glittered with the same happiness that her smile betrayed, and she gestured to the 4 standing just behind him, who had already pulled their shirts down, revealing the rainbow, U-tube-shaped molecule. Cautiously he turned, and the moment his eyes rested on them, he seemed to be overtaken by joy and humility.
Just below the left collarbone.
He paused, wiping his eyes on his sleeve.
I mean that much to all of you?
Yes.
Of course you do, kiddo!
You were the one who created an environment in which we could come to a better understanding with you and each other.
Even though he was the last one to state his agreement, Virgil knew exactly what he wanted to say, but waited until the YouTuber had turned to face him.
Thomas, you have no idea what being a trait is like, but I can try and tell you. We are immortal, living out our lives in 4 phases: moral, creative, logical, and negative, with each being longer than the one before.
So, you're the eldest. Hold on, how old are each of you then?
While their host had questions, he needed to finish what he had to say.
We will tell you with time, but for now, let me explain. I don't say any of this asking for sympathy or to depress you, just for you to understand the influence you've had on all of us.
Thomas nodded silently, allowing him to continue.
You have been through grief, the loss of your parents, brothers, and husband. Grief is hell, but with time, any kind of pain can fade. But how much grief do you think any one person can take?
The online personality stayed quiet, shrugging his shoulders, but anxiety hadn't really expected an answer.
I actually didn't realize it until recently, but anyone is able to handle more and more grief as they gain experience on the matter.
He pulled up the right leg of his jeans to show the faded mark a previous human had left on his ankle.
If the person is close to you, closer than any other before then,
He pulled at the collar of his shirt.
It can hurt as much as the first time you dealt with grief. Now for a trait, from the moment we turn 21 and can be assigned, we don't just lose one person at a time.
He gestured to Thomas and his own companions.
We lose 4. That being said, I am the oldest in this group by far, and yet with all of my experience, losing you, and then being plagued with the thought that I would soon lose Logan, Roman, and Patton as well, it felt like I was experiencing grief for the first time all over again. And the reason for that is simple. In the end, you were the only one to ever acknowledge our existence. You cared for us and helped us when we needed it most. A favor we can never repay. You went out of your way to accept me for who I was, and help the others to do the same. You were the one who noticed our faults and helped us strive to fix them, and be the best that we could be. But most of all, we have you to thank for what we all have been given today.
The observant side knew that his speech had been extremely articulate for him, and had hit close to home since he and the others were each in tears by the end of it. Next thing he knew, Thomas had his arms around him, a gesture he would have abhorred in the past, but he had grown close to the online personality. The fight-or-flight reflex didn't dare to pull away, for fear that everything that had been happening was just a dream. Hardly moving at all, he looked over to the others, gently motioning for them to join into the hug, which they did without hesitation. Morality nearly toppled the two as he slammed into them, but the prince quickly stabled them with his own embrace, and even logic allowed himself a moment of emotion as he too drew them close. As they broke apart, Thomas looked at them sadly.
Virgil, you said something about immortality. I had no idea. And I don't mean this in a crass way, but how old are each of you?
The moral trait smiled sadly.
As the youngest, I guess I'll start. You're the only host I've ever had, so I'm 118 years old.
The YouTuber blinked at him in shock.
So this was genuinely your first experience with grief?
He nodded gently.
Yes, but don't worry about me too much, kiddo.
He glanced to the rest of them.
I have a pretty great support system.
Princey placed his hand on the shoulder of the other.
We weren't just going to leave you.
He looked over to their host as if he'd only remembered what they were doing.
Oh, right. I'm the second youngest. You were my sixth host, and at 685, so that puts me at halfway through my creative phase.
Thomas looked shocked by the number, but remained silent, making the darker character wonder how he would react to his own age. But logic stepped forward, cutting off his thoughts.
I am the second oldest, and with you being the 17th host that I have been assigned to, I am 1,537.
The online personality turned to face him, and the others moved to say something, but he stopped them with a slight movement of his hand.
Thomas, I'm what you call a shadowed lifer, or I was. To put it bluntly, I don't remember how many hosts I've had. Too many to count, but there's more to it than that. I'm going to guess that you're wondering how I've had so many hosts to the point that I can't recall the number, and yet I have very few symbolic marks.
He took a deep breath to clear his mind.
Like I said, pain fades with time, and with no reason to keep grieving those I was certain I would never see again, the marks faded, if they ever appeared at all.
He saw the concern in the eyes of the online personality.
Then again, even with the 150,927 years of experience, I knew the mark you left would never fade.
Thomas didn't seem capable of hiding his surprise.
Can you repeat that number?
He chuckled softly, seeing the same expressions on Logan and Roman.
At 150,927, I'm the eldest of the group, and probably in this room at all.
Everyone but Patton looked at him with a mixture of shock, pain, and understanding, but it was Logan who let his voice rise into the silence, a terrified whisper.
One host.
As he trailed off, anxiety turned to face him, confusion prickling at the back of his neck.
What do you mean?
Logic met his gaze, the glimmer of fear there sending a shiver down his spine.
I said I would have only one more host before becoming a negative trait.
His breathing began to quicken.
One more host, and I had no idea that's what my thoughts would have been like. What?
Specs.
Virgil cut him off, placing a hand on his companion's shoulder.
First of all, there's no point in worrying about what could have been. Next, your thoughts would not have run that dark. Those weren't the thoughts of a negative trait. They were the ones of a shadowed lifer. Something you would and will never become. Do you understand?
He nodded, the cloud of horror dissipating from his eyes.
It is clear that the five of you have much to discuss, but you will have all the time you want to talk soon.
They looked up to the council leader.
For now, however, you will be escorted to the gates of Elysium, where you will all be permitted to live for the rest of eternity in peace.
Thomas had no clue as to how long it had been since he and the Sides had entered Elysium, nor did he care, but he did know he had never felt so happy or blissful. At first he had wondered if he could really live for eternity in contentment, without the presence of his family and friends, but as it turned out, those he had lost were waiting for him in paradise. The joy he had felt when he'd been reunited with the traits of his personality was only amplified when he'd finally seen his loved ones again. Currently, the YouTuber was heading to his room after staying up late to talk with Joan and Talon, seeing as they had only just gotten to Elysium. Reaching the top of the stairs, he came to a halt, looking out one of the windows. Outside, it was a quiet night, as always. The moon sat high in the sky, and the stars were so plentiful they looked like glitter on a midnight blue curtain. As winter had just begun, snow lay untouched and flawless along the branches of the trees and the ground below, save for the soft breeze that disturbed it now and again. The white powder and frost sparkled in the half-light of the celestial bodies above him, and with the washed-out colors of nearby holiday decorations. He took in the serenity of what looked to be a scene out of a Christmas movie, while the rest of the world was at rest one last time before moving towards his door, but something stopped him. There was someone else who enjoyed the wintry evenings just as he did, and the former online personality wondered if he might want some company. Changing course, he knocked quietly on the wooden surface that would soon be open to him, and sure enough, he answered almost immediately.
Come in.
He slowly opened the door and looked around the room as he stepped inside. It was dark, but still unaccountably beautiful, but at the same time functional and cozy. Even in the shadows, he could make out the picture frames that littered the walls and surfaces, each one bearing a happy memory. But that was really the only difference from the previous version of the area. Eventually, his eyes stopped on a bay window at one end of the room, where Virgil sat with his knees drawn to his chest, a blanket thrown over top of them, and what looked to be hot tea sitting next to him. A small black kitten lay around his shoulders, purring softly as her white teeth nibbled at his ear. Thankfully, when they had entered Elysium, Thomas had lost his allergies. What he was truly thankful for was the fact that Virgil had been able to be reunited with his beloved pet, Amaya.
What's got you up so late?
At the question, anxiety sighed with contentment, his breath momentarily creating a fog on the paned glass. Thomas felt the same sense of joy he had the first night all of them had been in Elysium, because if there was anyone who benefited most from living in their eternal home, it was the one who sat before him. Over time, the darkest trait had opened up about the hell that his life had been for so many thousands of years, and in the end it had proved to be comforting to the one in question. He had become more lively and pleasant, finally in a place where the negativity that had defined him for so long could no longer affect him. Even now, his voice reflected that.
I had forgotten how peaceful and calming the early hours can be.
The YouTuber smiled lightly. Nights used to be the most horrible for him, but there was no reason for worry anymore. Not now. Not here.
What has you awake?
Thomas sat down on the edge of the bed as his friend turned to face him.
Stayed up talking with Joan and Talon.
The fight-or-flight reflex smiled softly, a distant look of joy in his eyes, as if he were recalling some sort of memory before his former host continued.
I know how much you love nights like this, and I wondered if you might want some company.
It was an offer anxiety surely would have turned down in the past, but now he simply nodded and shuffled over, so that the online personality could take the place across from him. Once he'd settled down, his feet only inches from Virgil's, the character in question snapped his fingers, and another blanket fluttered down around his own ankles, protecting him from the cold that seeped through the glass. Seconds later, more tea appeared on the table nearby, and Thomas couldn't think of any situation that would make him feel more at ease, as the two of them gazed upon the world beyond the window, wrapped in blankets and the dark of night. By far, however, the most wonderful thing was knowing that those they both loved so deeply were safe to the point that the two of them could sit in such a comfortable silence, no longer as trait and host, but as family.